Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It's good to be with you. Please take a minute, like, share, subscribe, invite folks that are in here. I know that this is our second conversation of the day, and sometimes people catch one but miss the other one. So just make sure folks know that it's going on. I'm really excited, honored to host these two gentlemen to have this conversation. We had a prior conversation. I should have put that in the show description. I'll put it in there as we talk. But we had a prior conversation on their book, Laundering Black Rage, which did it fall down? No, it's behind my shoulder there. Probably around this time last year, I believe, is when we had our discussion of it. And excellent discussion, really interesting book. Really enjoyed talking to them. And they recently put out a new piece on Black Agenda Report, Bootleg, Rehab, Still Laundering Black Rage, which is excellent. It builds upon a particular metaphor around drug dealing and rehab that may have been the reason why our first conversation got demonetized in the first place. So we'll see if that happens again. But it's good to be with you all again. Like, share, subscribe, support us on Patreon. The Black Myths Patreon is also in the show description. Check out their work, support their work, and pick up a copy of Laundering Black Rage if you have not. And so today we're going to talk about this new piece, which really gets into a piece that they wrote that has a lot to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and specifically both situating it historically, understanding what it is, tracing that history, and then also talking about the kind of right-wing anti-DEI agenda that we see from President Trump in Trump 2.0, and how we should understand the kind of pro-DEI versus anti-DEI fight that we're seeing, and how we should situate ourselves to it as radicals, revolutionary people on the left, so on. So anyways, without further ado, I will welcome our guest to the stage. Two Black, welcome to the stage. Rasul Mowatt, thank you for joining us, both of you. It's great to be in conversation with you all again.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, for sure.
Looking forward to it.
Really enjoyed the piece. Really, again, I know that I appreciate all the writing that both of you do and the work that you've done together. But this was, not only is it a very interesting read, but it's also a fun read, which is not always the case on among us on the left. That our stuff is like, you can. It's enjoyable to read something that is also critical. I think that's a tough balance to strike sometimes. So I guess to start, I don't want to assume too much prior knowledge on this discussion about what do we mean when we say DEI. It certainly means different things to different people, and people orient themselves differently to this idea. And so the event, quote unquote, that kind of seems to have inaugurated this article is the attack by the Trump administration and other forces on DEI. But then there's also different efforts, I know, to among anti-Trump as a sort of broad camp of people that includes liberals, but also people on the left and others, to decide how to orient themselves also against this attack, right? Which has included things like boycotting Target or stuff like this, right? And so can you explain, how do you kind of start to explain to folks what DEI is? And if anything, what do you think is notable for you two about the cancellation of DEI initiatives, which is just sort of to say, how do we situate ourselves kind of starting this conversation?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say we necessarily wrote it based on the Trump administration's moves. We had been tracking this, honestly, during the Biden administration and seeing the decline of it. And I think a lot of folks who are now up in arms weren't tracking that this was getting, kicked out of a lot of corporations and even some schools prior to Trump ever getting in office. I think Trump is an escalation of it, and I think they've weaponized it in a way that's maybe different than just a quiet cancelization of certain programs or whatever. But I also think people have oddly enough forgotten about Florida, which is effectively a testing ground for a lot of this stuff. I mean, I actually myself even lost a speaking gig once because of all the different implementations. But what I found interesting even then is because as a kind of teaching tool was it wasn't even a DEI talk. It was just that the administrators were not organized and they were scared to even get labeled DEI. So it got canceled. I wasn't even going to speak on anything that fell under that category. They just didn't. They were just, so it kind of let us know, if you were watching what was happening in Florida and seeing how liberals were moving down there and how there was really not a lot of organization on knowing what to do with the attack on the university specifically, but more so even just broadly. It kind of gives you a sense of what was going to happen, because I don't think liberals are much more organized than they are in Florida anywhere else. So you kind of get to watch. It's kind of a prequel to this movie. And then also a lot of corporations had been, I don't know if that article is in the chat. I don't know if I can share it. I'm so used to pre-recording, so I never want to mess stuff up. If you scroll down, there's a chart. There's actually two charts, but there's a chart there that shows that there's one, you'll see, like, it'll show DEI jobs and non-DEI. There it is right there. So this is 2020 to 2021, and it says DEI roles are leaving companies almost twice as fast as non-DEI roles. And you can see nothing in there has Trump in office.
What does that even mean? Like, what are they talking about when they say DEI roles? I mean, that almost it sounds a little bit like Trump saying black jobs. I mean, like, like, I don't know what they mean by that. I mean, I'm sure they probably define it in the piece, but you're muted, by the way.
You're too black. You're
Black,
muted.
you're muted.
I think in this case, it's, if you look at the top of the article, it says it's big tech revealing its true colors, and it's mainly dealing with the jobs that emerged in tech, and a lot of people being laid off in tech. But it's tracking. So there was another stat is in 2020 there was actually a 55% spike in DEI related job openings following George Floyd. So as we note in our piece, there was this major, this kind of run to DEI as a solution to Black people being killed by the police, which we'll get to later was already a dead end solution anyway. So you saw a spike in jobs for DEI related stuff. That's primarily these jobs that are in companies such as, that have like like recruiting for getting more Black people, hiring or recruiting for getting more quote unquote diverse people into the corporation. That's primarily what they mean by DEI jobs. Now, as we know, it's become to mean virtually anything people want to make it to mean, right? And we kind of note that in the piece, that is this catch-all phrase, and we deal with it as the catch-all phrase as people are discussing it, even though we did do our research to understanding specifically what I guess people claim DEI is. And then also it's like as we note in the piece, it's went through a lot of different versions. There's D, there's I, there's DI, there's E, there's EDI, there's IDEA, there's DEIJ, there's JEDI, as in Jedi. And there's actually an article that we linked there of somebody arguing about why calling it Jedi is problematic, because the Jedis are problematic as a concept for DEI. Like, this is linked in the piece, right? So there's DEIB, there's DEIBJ, and I think that's all we reference. There's probably more. Rasul did the work of going through a lot of these different videos of people on Instagram and ruined both of our algorithms and sending me some of them, people who are kind of trying to defend DEI, but them saying so it's hard to define DEI because the people doing it don't really have a clear definition either. So we're not, there's no really reason to give it one definition. It's actually worsely defined than like people on the left try to talk about fascism or something. Like there's no real clear definition of it. I think in general, if I'm trying to sum it up and not, judge it on one side or the other, I think it's to say some kind of project that seeks to have a workforce that is reflective of the general population, right? On all levels of a company, on all levels of a government, on all levels of nonprofits, et cetera. And then a lot of other things that don't really have anything to do with that kind of simple definition get dragged into it. So if you're doing Black studies, it's DEI, even though Black studies doesn't come out of that tradition at all. If you're doing critical race theory, it's DEI, even though it doesn't come out of that tradition. And again, coming back to Florida, notice Florida didn't originally they originally were going at like critical race theory. They weren't actually saying DEI as much. That became the more they realized, oh, that's the better catch-all thing. So it was this catchphrase that you could use. But our overall point is, it's been on its decline. That's not our overall. There's a lot of more points, but one of the points is it's been on its decline. It hasn't really, it has not resolved. Police killings have went up since 2020. It has not resolved the issues. Shout out to Renee Johnston over at Black Power or Black Liberation Media. We she gave me, I don't have these on the screen to show, but she looked at Target, which people are boycotting now, right? And she looked at the 2020 diversity kind of report and the 2023, and the numbers are literally damn near the same. They just added this block that says people of color that wasn't on the 2021 to the 2023 one. But in terms of how many Black people worked there, when you look at from 2020 to 2023, almost in every category from management to the board of directors actually went down. There's less Black people on the board of directors now than there was in 2020. Black workers in general, it's damn near the same. So it brings us to this question of why are people boycotting something that's not clearly dealing with the material conditions that people were outraged about in 2020, particularly related to police killings of Black people. And even if you are in the DEI space, it's not working. Like, it's not getting any more people jobs. It's not producing anything. But people are up in roar saying we're going to boycott it and we're going to buy Black, which, again, that's another thing. This can go a million different directions because there's so many contradictions that come up. But I'm just trying to give people a sense of some of like DEI's limitations so we can get more into the actual piece, because we don't really spend a lot of time speaking on these things. Actually, I just want to give people a little bit of a backdrop as to the milquetoast nature of DEI in of itself. It does not actually resolve the problems that it claims to resolve, both from either a radical lens or even within the kind of HR framework that they present. So we came up with this analogy of bootleg rehab, which I don't know where this idea just kind of hits, but hit out of the blue. But like, it's this, we say basically that, let's say there's a poor Black neighborhood that has a drug problem. There's just a scourge of drugs that have been rushed into the community. And they want that obviously to end. And then the drug dealer that's bringing the drugs in the community says, we're going to start a rehab center, right? But then that drug dealer uses that rehab center to still launder their drug money. So the drugs are never leaving the community. They just gave you a rehab center. It's not well staffed. And they start doing things like drug addicts matter and we have to support drug addicts, right? They do all these things to affirm your addiction and getting off addiction. And then people like rally around that. But the drugs keep flowing. The community still has a drug problem. But now we have a rehab center owned by the very people who gave us the drug problem. So then that occurs and people get rallied around that. And then years later, another drug dealer, a competing kingpin, comes in and they're like, actually, the rehab center discriminates against drug dealers, right? Like that's how it gets even sillier, like a more buffoonish one. I think people could figure out who that would be in this story. And they're like, we're gonna shut those down and we're gonna have strip clubs instead, and we're gonna hire more people within the community. But this person is still laundering drugs as well. Like, so on either end, so the community feels compelled to defend the rehab center because it's obviously insulting to say that a rehab center discriminates against drug dealers. But at the end of the day, both sides are laundering drugs. Your community still has drug problems, right? None of this is went away. But we're put in a position to try to defend one over the other, even though the thing that we're defending has actually helped demobilize us and disorganize us even further. And we say that analogy that analogy is not even really a full snapshot, because the way we think about DEI is actually worse than this, the way it's playing out in the real context. That's just to give people a sense of it. So then the piece goes through a kind of general history of kind of how DEI emerges. Shout out to Black Agenda Report for pressing us to make more of a distinction between affirmative action and DEI, even though we find that those things to be intermingled. The history needed to be, for people who say Black Agenda doesn't have any editorial leadership. I've heard these criticisms, like we were pushed to add more. So shout out to them for that. And we walked through the history, and Rasul did a great job of, I think, really dealing with like the impacts of all this backwards behavior that it inspires, and the way it really demobilizes folks as capital is marched forward. So that's just a general breakdown of it. There's a lot more to say. Rasul could say more, but I just wanted to kind of walk people through the kind of general stuff and how DEI is not, we're defending something. A lot of us are defending something that is actually not resolving your problem. So you have to ask, why is that? We can get to the anti-DEI side of it that we did address too, but which is like the rights version of a front. But just to stop, I'll leave it there.
No, I appreciate it. Russell, I'd love to hear from you a little bit, but I just wanted to say I really enjoyed, that was part of what I was talking about in terms of it being an enjoyable read. I thought that the metaphor of the rehab center and, the drug dealer, I think it really does a good job of, helping people to understand this, because I think sometimes when we have, and I know we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but sometimes when we have our critiques of DEI on the left, I think it can fall kind of flat to people because they're like, what, you don't like diversity in the workforce? Like, what the fuck's wrong with you? And obviously that's not the point. But I think you laying that out is a good illustration of the problem with what this thing actually is, and thinking about it more, the problem of thinking about it as a solution to the problems that it purports to seek to address, kind of. But yeah, Rasul, I'd love to hear from you a little bit, talking about, kind of your contributions to the piece and the things that you looked at within it.
Yeah, no, I mean, real brief, because I know we want to try to get through a lot of different, points, but again, going back to you asking us sort of the birth of this essay. Any of us who sort of take the conditions in which we live seriously, research never stops. And so, we've just been in the same process of looking at things tied to what we were looking at for the book. And it wasn't to say that we were planning on ever doing another essay, or, maybe at best, if there's a later edition of Laundering Black Rage, we just wanted to be ready for whenever that comes down some future road 5 years from now. But it really wasn't about getting published as much as just staying, sharp and staying in the sort of space of, really looking at things. And so we were noticing those patterns the fall of 2020, and then, peaking, in the fall of 2021. And so then we were already seeing the changes that people actually are now reacting to, back then, but with very little sort of reaction. There were clearly journalists who covered it because that's the only way that we would be able to get the information that we sought, but it just really was very little. But we wanted to sort of keep charting this and see where it was going. The other particular part I just want to sort of briefly sort of deal with, especially when we think about DEI professionals, even though now it's a catch-all, it's probably important to sort of distinguish typically how this may play out, not only for companies, but also for universities, for nonprofits, and so forth. A DEI professional would be first level and officer, sort of like in tandem to maybe an HR sort of, officer, but without the sort of authority that an HR officer technically would have, human relations officer. Or the DEI officer would be more of sort of social relations within the space, gatherings, birthdays. I hate to sort of belittle it, but in essence, that's oftentimes what it was. So one DEI professional is the actual officer that's embedded in the actual institution. The second type of DEI professional that we can sort of think about is the consultant, the person who's hired on typically at a sort of exorbitant cost to sort of deal with some specific aspect. Sometimes that could be a very quick sort of task, and sometimes that could be an ongoing sort of contract. in universities that may be not necessarily tied to the hiring of maybe professionals from various sort of underrepresented groups, but it may be more so aiding them with, preparing for the next stage or promotion. So how to, maybe write papers for publications, how to write grants. So some outside consultant would be, sort of handling that sort of space of duty. Again, sometimes short term, sometimes long term. And then the third and final sort of DEI professional would be trainers, people who either were just independent shops, just an individual who would be hired, or eventually there were then, consultant, firms that were established with a host of trainers that then people would, travel if they were hired to then do some one-shot training over a weekend or a day or several hours and so forth. And so in terms of DEI professionals, that's typically what's kind of thought of, but again, now it's a catch-all for anybody that has any association with anything to deal with anything, just about. And then I think the last particular point, just to throw in there, is another sort of tangential thing that we were both sort of looking at was this constant flattening or reduction of important sort of concepts. So abolition, decolonization, these were things that we were just constantly noticing that were increasing in number, where abolition no longer meant ending a thing. Decolonization no longer meant anything associated with an actual colony ending, or other aspects. I mean, even the very words of DEI are sort of taken out and not given anything. So equity, and so equity, typically we think about equity in terms of pay, in particular, and DEI has no authority or has ever sort of ventured into the pay equity space. Making sure that people are hired at the right salary, people get promoted in the right way, people are paid for their promotion in the right way. So we were just seeing this flattening and reduction of terms. And that really, sort of stuck in with us, because DEI was never really about addressing the actual material conditions. And so that's why one of the passages in the essay really tackles this point about all this sort of discussion of producing DEI professionals was really about hiring individuals, to, occupy a particular space to satisfy a window dressing of an issue, but never there was a DEI housing, complex. There was never, a DEI, factory built within the neighborhood area for
food pantry,
DEI. Like there was never DEI. There's never been both, literally or even, consciously us ever thinking DEI related to something like that. DEI programming at best by an officer was, again, social relations, birthdays, holidays, coming together gatherings, these types of things. But it was never about actually addressing, material conditions on the campus. The DEI person was not managing the residence halls, which is one of the, probably most important, administrative job in relationship to, higher education, student affairs. How do you sort of provide this housing that's a part of their sort of tuition? Not to say that housing out in the community also has no space, but typically there's no corporation or entity that is handling, all of the housing except for the housing authority. And so I just wanted to kind of mention those additional sort of points. And looking forward to figuring out how we sort of tease apart our sort of venting essay.
Yeah. I'll just say too, I mean, I have experiences with this as well, and especially in the post-George Floyd context. I was working for a nonprofit that was related to educational services and things like this, after school programs, charter schools, this kind of stuff, right? And what I would say, because I worked in leadership, I was in administration, and I dealt with other people that were in administration in this moment. And what I can say is that they identified in that moment that they had a branding problem. that there was suddenly a recognition of, oh, there's this big movement that's kind of pissed off about white supremacy, and we're predominantly white organizations serving predominantly Black students, was like the reality that we were in, right? And so the interest of the folks who were making decisions around this was largely to try to deal with what they felt was a perception issue of them being able to do this work, and their own, and also I would say their own guilt, right? People's guilt, like a kind of white guilt sort of thing, right? So this is just one example, but you bring in consultants, you start task forces and meetings and things like this, right? And what I will say too, because this is the reason that made me bring this up, is both the article and this discussion of equity, is that actually a lot of times in those instances, and it certainly happened where I was, pay equity did become a part of the conversation, and it was at that point that it all got shut down too. Yeah. So it's like, as you look at that arc of like where a bunch of people got these jobs, and then it's like, it's all fine and good until people really start bringing up the actual material components of the racism, and that actually is a thing that the organization could move to address, right? But it's fine when we're all doing the implicit bias training and we're, but once people start talking about money, that becomes, then these people are a problem. I mean, one of the things I can remember a colleague saying is, this sure seems like unionization right now. And so, I just wanted to share that, because this was definitely part of the trajectory, is like, once you also start dealing with discussions around these issues, to a lot of people, that surface level of, okay, it's nice when we talk about decolonization, abolition, and and inclusion, but that equity piece, we really need to talk about that, and so anyways, I just wanted to say
I'll just really quick, appreciate that sort of add on, Jared, because I think another part that we want to sort of express before we really get into the meat of everything is, we know that a lot of this is real people, and so real people are thinking about their day-to-day livelihood, and they're looking for jobs that are less sort of strenuous, are maybe easier to do, that could pull from maybe their sort of ready-made skills, as opposed to really sort of pursuing something else. And so so when we get into really criticizing, we're not really thinking about specific people, and we're not talking about specific people. We're just talking about the realities of things that we don't see the bigger picture. We don't see the legacy of this before we enter it, and we don't see the machinery behind it, right? Until we sort of start facing difficulties. But go ahead, Black.
No, yeah, and I was just gonna, I guess, to kind of plug the book, but it's actually a relevant story. Like, we, in the book, in Laundering Black Rage, and the introduction, I usually don't like personal narrative, but we both kind of use it a little bit because we found it useful. Like, Rasul talks about the diversity thing as the proverbial hand on the shoulder of it's I'm sorry, it's so hard to be Black, but like all the diversity statements that came out. But also, like, there was I had a story, and I think it was in 2020, I think it was 2023. And I because I also am still a performance poet, like I still perform poetry sometimes. And I was at a art museum, Newfield's Art Museum. I have no problem because it's in the book. So Newfield's Art Museum here in Indianapolis. And I was just there for a Martin Luther King Day thing. Somebody that was curating reached out and asked me to perform. So I just did, I came in, did it solid, and I was about to leave. And, I always have a thing where I talk to the workers at anything I go to. I just think it's a good practice. It's not like, I'm not saying it's revolutionary, but I think you should just do that, because you go to these museums and stuff, and these are people set the chairs up, and these are people that got to deal with all the annoying patrons, So I was just saying, I was just talking with him, wasn't really trying to get anything deep, and there was a display there by by a nonprofit called Gang Gang that had gotten. Or they're actually not a nonprofit technically. They're a startup company that did get seed capital from foundations. It was an interesting model. And they had this thing called We're the Culture, and it was a setup of all these Black artists, and it had all this Black art on the wall. And I wasn't even actually knocking. I was like, I guess this is cool for y'all, because it was two Black women I was talking to, two workers, and I was like, I guess it's nice to see more Black art in here. Like, I was just kind of chatting it up, and without me really, I wasn't in organizer mode. I was really just chatting, and they just started going off like, yeah, it's cool, but it's actually gotten worse since 2020. They were like, and they just, because there had been a whole scandal at this museum, I think around, like, I don't remember precisely when, but there was a scandal around 2020 about they said they wanted to preserve white art. There was a thing that got leaked out. I think it was actually for a job that they were looking to hire for. And the museum said they wanted to preserve white art. So obviously especially people in the arts, got outraged. And anyway, like, that led to them hiring a Black, like, CEO of the museum. So from the outside looking in, they have a new Black CEO. They have Black art on a predominantly white museum that doesn't really carry a lot of Black art from local artists. So that it looks like it's going well, but the Black workers are like, things have gotten worse. And they talked about, to the point of the DEI consultant and somebody who came in. It was another Black woman of a different class that came in and tried to tell them about their job and what they needed to do when they probably needed assistance, because they had to deal with all these white patrons that are walking around that are annoying and rude and stuff. And then they said they tried to start a union, and that got shut down. To your point, Jared, literally they tried to start a union, it got shut down, and the Black CEO eventually ends up leaving anyway after all that, because and the white art is preserved. The people that got to push their stuff, the few Black artists that benefited off of it, got that, and the workers are just kind of left to deal with the rubble. And this is just one example of what happens more than often. So yeah, it's not it's not really dealing with the material conditions. So the people who are actually most affected, that's another DEI term, right? Like, most affected, most marginalized, that gets thrown around a lot. Those people often are not considered, but the DEI consultant got paid. The organization that was able to come in and be kind of the PR recovery for the art museum. So because of that we want to preserve white art, you got the Black art in there. Like, everybody got off, but the workers couldn't get a union, got called out of their name, got talked bad to in meetings. So that just gives you an example. Again, I know it's anecdotal, but I just think that it's important. Like Rasul said, these are real people. So sometimes these anecdotal stories are helpful to frame, like, this is often the experience, not that the workplace has been, firmly improved, especially for these kind of jobs that are not, if you've ever worked at an art museum, like, those are not high paying jobs. I'm talking about the people who are just on the floor, telling folks where to go to the bathroom or something. Those are not great jobs.
Yeah, no, 100%. And I think even for, like, obviously it would be different on a case-by-case basis, but I think with Rasul, I think also talking about DEI professionals, I think a lot of people do actually go into that field thinking, I can do something that can help,
Right.
and, like, then get often burnt out by those jobs too, because they're like, oh, like, actually I can't do shit here. I'm just, like, putting, like, they come to understand it as kind of a branding, PR, training thing, but not actually something that is addressing the material conditions.
And it demobilizes. We'll get to it more later, but this demobilizes people. Like you said, it burns them out. It does not necessarily inspire people to want to work. They're just like, I'm good.
Right on. Yeah. So let's go back a little bit, because the history, you do kind of trace some of the history of what you are all looking at as DEI through what you call the long civil rights movement to present. So yeah, I think it would be just good if you kind of do a little bit of that historical kind of analysis that you offer in the piece.
Russell, do you want to do that? I have some stuff to say about even further back than the essay. So I don't know if you want me to.
Yeah.
Because I see in one of your questions, you brought up the question of military and policing. So I wanted to kind of just give I'm gonna just kind of pass the baton, Rasul. So I'm gonna just give a little backdrop of some of the other. So one of the books that we read for this essay, the Minority Rights Revolution, by John Scretany. It's actually a really good book that if you want to get a good history on affirmative action and integration and kind of the integration of like the reason why the state pursued the kind of civil rights framework that we've kind of come to understand, and then it gives you a little bit about how DEI even evolves out of the kind of 1978 court case. But there was just a little bit of history that we embedded in here, but we didn't get to like speak about it more broadly. So I think that book talks specifically about integration as a means of national security. And I think when we're thinking about DEI, where it's gotten to now, integration was a means of national security. And what we mean by that was coming out of World War II, or really not even coming out of it, even during World War II, there was a sense of how to combat the propaganda. We often will hear about the Soviet Union, but this is even prior to that. They're trying to also combat the propaganda of the Nazis and the Japanese, because they were also hitting on the racial inequality, quote unquote, the white supremacy of the United States, ironically. But so they're trying to combat that. So this was not, and this is explicitly stated in like State departments and within the White House. So this isn't something that the author just kind of is I guess tagging on to them. So he gives a little history. I'm gonna just walk through it a little briefly here. So he says British author H.G. Wells began to promote the concept of an international declaration of human rights. And he was one of the first people to kind of push this idea. And he ends up getting this to Roosevelt, who's the president at the time. And he was especially active in October of 1940. He pushed the idea as a war aim to Roosevelt and other leaders. So even when we're talking about international human rights, he's saying that is a war aim. That is a way you can combat the regime that you're fighting against, is talking about human rights and this kind of Roosevelt put it as in a speech later that year as an arsenal, the United States being this arsenal of democracy. So before that, United States didn't promote itself as much. It always was full of itself, but not nearly as much as this, city on a hill that was like cared about everybody. Like it was pretty well okay to just say certain people are lesser than, and that was just that. It wasn't as like big of a deal, despite what was in the Constitution or whatever. I'm talking about the daily practices of the government were not really as interested in using these meanings. So they start promoting that. And then post World War II, I'm kind of skipping over certain things. Truman even wrote in his diary, Harry Truman, who was the president after Roosevelt, and this is in 1945, propaganda seems to be our greatest foreign relations enemy. The Russians distribute lies about us. So in the early 1950s, the State Department actually estimated that nearly half of the Soviet propaganda was about racial equality. So half of the propaganda, according to the State Department, was about this, the Soviets pointing out like all of these black people being lynched, or the Jim Crow, or things of this nature, right? So there became an impetus by particularly the State Department, the Justice Department, and the White House to push forward civil rights. This is not a knock on the people who organized for it. I just want to give this backdrop as a means of national security. And that's really how they thought about it. So he says, in 1946, the frequently cited later civil rights advocates, acting Secretary of State Dean Acheson communicated the national security implications of equal rights, that the existence of discriminations against minority groups in the United States is a handicap to our relations with other countries. That is again, I'll read it again. The existence of the discriminations against minority groups in the United States is a handicap to our relationships with other countries. So it was understood that integration was a means of national security to fighting a kind of imperialist agenda across the world, because you're trying to win these countries over to capitalism. And it's hard to do that when you have Jim Crow and you have these kind of explicit expressions of racism going on. So the State Department starts hiring more Black people, really just hiring Black people at all in the State Department to represent. And they start hiring foreign diplomats to represent. And they start negotiating with, like in DC, it was big that they wanted to integrate DC. And they wanted to, even though that never really happened, and then they wanted to. And then when like say a leader from Africa came over, from a different country came over, they negotiated deals with Maryland because Maryland still had a more Southern style racial arrangement there. So they negotiated deals with Maryland where, hey, if they come here, like don't mess with them because a lot of them were getting arrested and pulled over and things of that nature, right? So even the last point, and I'll pass it on because again, I'm just going to stop at Truman for the sake of time. The Justice Department submitted briefs to the Supreme Court on discrimination. They argued the civil rights protections was a matter of national security. So in the case of Shelley versus Kramer, that was a strike down racially restrictive covenants. And then Henderson versus United States, which I think was related to desegregated, not busing like in a city, but busing from city to city, like trains and things of that nature. So this was all prior to 1954 and the whole Brown versus Board of Education that, I think Gerald Horne rightly calls like the compromise of 1954, where class politics kind of gets put down for more of a racial representative politics, right? So I'm saying I think that part that's embedded in our citations, but we didn't flesh this out as much just because we weren't trying to write a book. But I think that part is important in thinking about DEI today, because the state at the time understood this as a form of national security, right? It was, and then so it's interesting that Trump and them are using anti-Semitism very similarly, as a form of national security and also as a way of combating anti-Semitism worldwide. They use that as a reason to round up all these students, right? They use it to round up all these people and kick people out of the country. So there's a certain mindset and a certain approach that the government and the broader state is taking that trickles down to different entities, whether that be private entities or so forth, that even precedes the civil rights movement, as we might call it. Even though I don't think me and Rasul think the civil rights movement starts in like 1960 or anything, but how we may popularly understand it, at least, within like 1955, 1960, that framework is important for folks to think about when we're talking about now integration into like the equity and the diversity and inclusion. You can not necessarily draw a straight line, but you can see a history that kind of connects to this, that is really just a matter of national security and calming down the angry mob, and doing things like also integrating the military and even our leaders. We were very critical of even Black leaders in our piece have taken on this position. Part of how they got to military integrated was due to, A. Philip Randolph was one of the main ones to push that, and they would push it. And the way they justified integrating the military under, I believe, Eisenhower was the one that really put it forward, but Truman's the one that wrote the directive. That was still a matter of its national security reasons to integrate the military. So I just want to give people that backdrop.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of me chiming in, I think within sort of what Two Black was talking about is also, and we didn't sort of articulate in this particular way, but there's soft power and there's hard power, and both are done to both, manage domestic affairs and manage, international affairs, global affairs. Hard power is thought of as any sort of force or enforcement. So whether that's, law enforcement, police forces, sheriffs, security forces, patrols. Then there's military, the different branches, of the military. Think of, maybe prison centers and other sort of holding spaces, detention centers. These are all sort of hard power things, but hard power is costly, both in terms of literally, in terms of costs of weaponry and equipment and so forth, costs of paying people per hour for their time to watch a facility, to patrol a neighborhood, these types of things. But it's also costly because it will just lead to more rage or reaction, because of people being sort of put under even worse conditions than the ones that they were just living under, with just bad employment, bad water, these types of things. Now that you have added, security checks and, searches in homes and these types of things. So that's hard power. And then we can think of soft power then as all the elements that sort of can coerce or entice people to move in another direction than, rage or rebellion. So that's, forms of entertainment. It's not really, covered in, as much in this essay, but it is in our, book, Laundering Black Rage, where we really talk about the role that the Harlem Cultural Festival played, that, that's sort of featured in The Summer of Soul, that Questlove directed, was really actually about, one, getting Mayor Lindsay reelected, but the other part was to be this alternative space. And that's why the acts that were part of the performance were never the more radical acts. The Last Poets, weren't part of the lineup ever. The Gil Scott Heron was not a part of the lineup ever. Within this, space, the what is the Lumpen Proletariat, the Black Panther Party sort of band, they weren't a part of this particular space, as well as other bands that sort of had some sort of connections, even though maybe their music wasn't overtly political. So that, entertainment, other types of soft power could be forms of education, schooling, institutions of education, both, as young as, of course, nursery school, and as, of course, as high as college. So I just want to kind of give those two concepts, because then that gets into how much the rage and the rebellions of the 60s and 70s really concerned the United States. Specifically, of course, Black rage and Black rebellion, but that really wasn't the only thing, because, they know that, responding to conditions is contagious, and people will imitate that because they're inspired now to no longer comply. And so that could spill out to the already existing and strong anti-war movement, and the actors within and the organizations within the anti-war movement, as well as the labor movement, which was heavily strong. And so if all of a sudden there's three major movements that are now moving beyond negotiation and discussions, that could be problematic. So, really, we think about this time period as the foundation of DEI, then, because it is a response to, it's a counter movement to quell this developing desire for liberation that these movements were moving towards. And so in particular, Johnson does a commencement speech, and I know this is the time of year commencement, so it just happens to be, coincidental. And he gives this commencement speech at Historically Black College Howard, which is in Washington, D.C. And he expresses these affirmative action policies that he would like to see implemented, going beyond what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was sort of speaking to. And in the speech, he is trying to push the graduates and those who are listening there that, he wants them to become the leaders, and he wants them to also develop future leaders. And while that may sound benign on the surface, because that's typically what most commencement speeches sound like still to this day, we have to think about the context. We're in the midst of pretty well-known leadership that's being represented in newspapers, in newsreels, in movies, and in on TV, tied to these particular movements. They're speaking to large crowds. They're organizing organizations. So this is the leadership that's existing out in the real world. So who he's talking to are not those people. And so he's calling for an alternative leadership class. Of course, it doesn't sort of, move, exceptionally far, because he chooses not to, continue on, as president, but he does issue an executive order that begins to address sort of discrimination in federal contracting. This is also, done at the local level. For example, Philadelphia was beginning to address their issues of contracting, and what we mean by that is still up into the 60s, Black people in Philadelphia were being locked out of most union jobs, and union jobs have always been classically, even from since the 1870s, the stable sort of income, the type of jobs that can create some level of upward mobility. That may not be the case anymore now, but up until at least the 1990s, that was the case. That you get a stable union job, you can have health care, you can have sort of a steady sort of a raise, increase of pay, and so forth. And so this executive order is initiated. Of course, who comes next is Richard Nixon. I guess one part of the editing that we, just to kind of mention, is that we typically do not mention president names in our work, but it was asked of us, and it was a negotiation that we, went ahead and sort of complied with. But, please know that we're not sort of changing our position on, not naming, presidents. So we would typically say 37th, 38th president, that type of thing. But Richard Nixon, comes in, and he's also sort of, pulling from this sort of affirmative action sort of language. And he begins to sort of think through a soft power, even though the FBI is implementing a hard power agenda, even without maybe Nixon initiating it completely, every single act, right? He's thinking that maybe some of these militants, these Black militants, really are desiring, self-ownership, creation of their own sort of communities of business.
I just want to read. He says,
yeah.
These militants they wanted inclusion, not as supplicants, but as owners, as entrepreneurs, to have a share of the wealth and a piece of the action. That was a quote, and he makes this. Nixon, just a quick thing. Nixon's interesting because if there is differences in presidents, Lyndon B. Johnson frames affirmative action as as a more reparative type. Like in that commencement speech, it's more like Black people. It's not enough to just beat you down for hundreds of years and then just say now you're free. You have to do something about the past. Nixon doesn't actually deal with. He doesn't really like. If you read particularly policies on business, like the Black capitalism nonsense, they don't. There's nothing in the writings that suggests it's a way to deal with the past. It's more of a market-friendly approach, which is the world we're more so in today. But continue.
Yeah, and so for him, he's flipping Black power, to meaning no longer these movements towards liberation, but now to sort of self-control of their communities, but self-control within the sort of approved ways to control. So businesses that are acceptable, laundromats, grocery stores,
McDonald's,
well, eventually, McDonald's and these types of things, but probably early on, the cleanup, programs, they were, organizations that were tied to community cleanup, people literally sweeping the floor, streets, which are, I guess, a new thing now in a lot of cities. I'm noticing that over the past sort of 5 years, the hiring of people just to actually literally sweep the streets of a city in many different places. The Supreme Court that's moving alongside Nixon agrees with Nixon's interpretations, and they end up ruling in a particular important case, Regents of University of California versus Bakke, with a 5-4 ruling. So very close. It was, doomed to almost fail. But yeah, go ahead. Your mic is off too, Black.
Yeah. Sorry, it was actually a plurality decision. So it actually was a 4-4.
Right.
And Powell wrote the memo to kind of deal with the division. Because Powell's like, Powell basically, and it's interesting, Powell's also, people who are familiar with like the Powell memo, and Powell basically saying like, we're getting our ass kicked by all these left people, so business needs to come together. And that's how you get like the business roundtable and all that. So that same person, Lewis Powell, wrote the memo, or wrote the, I guess, the opinion that kind of splits the difference. I mean, he doesn't agree with the categories of a minority at all. Like, he thinks they're arbitrary. But yeah, he says, but he writes an opinion that then the other 4 judges who were in favor of it then go to his side.
Yeah.
And that's how you actually get 5-4. But it was actually a plurality. There was no majority.
Yeah. And so this establishes racial quotas at universities. So this is when we begin to sort of see an increase and uptick, a second wave of.
Well, it removes racial quotas.
Yeah. Well, yeah. But the racial quotas were like altered in some way.
Yeah, because I don't want to get too deep into the case of, but like, this is why I appreciate Black Agenda Report, because I had to go back and read all this to clarify what they wanted me to fix. But so it's like it was 100. It's at the medical school at actually UC Davis. That's why it's the Regents of the Regents of the Regents of University of California. They had 100 spots open for incoming freshmen. And at the time, 16 were just made for quote unquote minority groups. Those 16 spots went to them no matter what. And the white guy, is it Bakke or Bach, however you say his name, he felt that he said my test scores are higher than these people, and therefore I should be able to get in, and I was discriminated against. And he said it actually violates the 14th Amendment. And then so that becomes so the racial quotas are more like become more implicit after that. You can no longer say explicitly, we're going to give these 15 slots to Black people. Like that's considered illegal after that point. Yeah.
But in terms of the 60s, so it's interesting in the sense that in the 60s they were setting up the racial quotas, and this is where the relationship between affirmative action and diversity sort of steeps in, because there's this language around the need to diversify the student body, to make education a space of diversity.
Right. And that goes back even the early 60s. So I guess like another thing just to clarify for the listeners, because I know this is a lot, there are really like 2 tracks here. There was like this more idea of the reparative kind of affirmative action, and that's how you get more of the quota base. And then there was this, like when you go read about like Harvard deans at the time, like even the 1960s, like Berger was his name, and different like deans over elite universities had this idea of the kind of just we need to have a population that reflects, our school body that reflects the population, so people can learn from different folks, and that will create better leaders of tomorrow, right? Like, so there's these kind of 2 tracks. So Powell, actually, if you read his memo or read his opinion, he sides with that logic and that reasoning versus and again, this is not to big up Lyndon B. Johnson or them either, but it is to say that path might have led to a bit better quote unquote reform. So diversity is a much more market friendly, or even what Nixon was putting forward, much more market friendly, because now when we're talking about DEI, it has nothing to do with the past, right? Like that's like within the official memos, you don't hear that. It's very much how we just need to include everybody. But that wasn't really the impetus for why maybe certain civil rights leaders got behind it. Because like a lot of people, when Nixon was doing all of his stuff, a lot of those Black leaders didn't want anything to do with that. It's important to note that. Yeah. But go ahead. I'm just
no. And just an example of universities and their sort of language, I guess, to add. I mean, even though I'm down here in Raleigh, North Carolina, and there's of course issues between certain cities and certain universities here. I guess I'm also piling on to the losing in the tournament, as well as the whatever upheaval with the shirt on White Lotus or whatever else. But in 1962, Duke University Admissions Committee issues a report, and it states as following, we believe that a policy should be established to enable the admissions officer to seek out students from socioeconomic levels not presently very well represented in the student bodies of the colleges. Sharp minds and determined spirits of such students should help leaven our mass of upper middle class, suburban, and well-to-do groups. And so, that's literally
that's 62. Yeah.
And that's 62. And also an interesting piece, like these presidents are talking to each other, and their desire is also to produce a class of people to sort of quiet down the rebellions, in many different ways. So then when we come to this 78 ruling that ends sort of outright sort of official quotas, it's in some sense, like almost a acknowledgement of the success of that past work, in the sense that these organizations had begun to die, by 78. Their presence, their impact, their influence, and alongside that, people were being hired, Black people specifically were being hired now in better jobs than they had ever been, because before there was a de facto sort of, limited occupation range that the majority of Black people could fall in. So this is really what we sort of think about as the key foundation. Mind you, there is no official term or terminology, diversity, and diversity program, but this is the spirit of it. And so this is why, again, we see that there's a relationship, with affirmative action and diversity, because without this sort of affirmative action policy push, you wouldn't have then the need to set up these sort of diverse language needs to create variety, the need to mix up and to influence, populations.
Yeah,
Right on. Yeah. And go ahead.
Just real quickly, again, the Minority Rights Revolution, I would recommend people read that, because another thing he says is the 1965 bill on immigration,
Right.
done with the same logic, and he uses that as a way to prove that even though the movements were strong, he's like, there really wasn't a major movement at the time for like to reform immigration, right? Because up to that point, immigration was not coming from the global South nearly to the extent that it does post 1965. But that was also a national security reason. He says that it gets that passed because they're trying to compete with the other powers across the world. So like, let's brain drain and things of that nature. So what you end up with is like these different. So it starts with, it's like Rasul said, it's not just the Black Rage, it's other groups, and it's like, okay, like Nixon. It was funny reading that book. Reached out to a lot of Latino folks to do minority, quote unquote, minority business, because they thought it was a voting bloc. But they interestingly didn't want to reach out to Asian folks because they didn't think they were a real constituency. He even says part of the reason why gender is probably not included in a lot of this stuff earlier on is because gender wasn't seen as a kind of counterinsurgency at the time. Like, there was no reason, gender wasn't a national security problem in the way that they thought race was. So the state didn't necessarily coin it as something to feature, but then other groups obviously started going on, and we know about that famous report that showed that most jobs that related to affirmative action went to white women, majority, most of those, and then we also see how even majority of diversity chief diversity officers are also white people and white women. But that's as a side note. But just to show that. But yeah, go ahead, Russell. Yeah.
I was going to say just that the early parts of the 70s and the later parts of the 70s are look drastically different, and so the attitudes towards Asian populations in 1970 are still the antiquated anti-Chinese Exclusion Act type of mentality, the Japanese internment. Then of course there are people who are anti-Vietnam, but not for the good reasons, in the sense, they just don't feel that we should be putting tax dollars, on those sort of grubby people in that type of way. That's in the 1970s. And, the Asian populations in the United States are feeling that as well. And this is why then, the Third World, sort of liberation front really is established. And, Asian American comes up as a term, a political identity term, to sort of rally, these disparate groups that did not see sort of linkages between each other. And then what ends up happening is that then they're fractured by this creation of the term minority. And so then you start having these magazine narratives that were being produced, model minority. You see that within, the 1970s, where, not Asians in general, but specifically Chinese, populations are then taken out of the Asian minority category, especially in relationship to schools, universities, and so forth. And so it's just I just want to kind of, also bring that particular up, and how these things were also fracturing, dynamics and relationships.
Solidarity.
Yeah, and again, I think a lot of people just don't realize that what we live, what we're living through right now hasn't always been how it looks today. And so, there were alliances and coalitions politically, but also there were different, heightened levels of violence to other sort of, communities, in the United States. And so it's just not, and I think it's a thing where I think people don't sort of, recognize that fact. And of course, right now, I don't want to bring up another popular culture reference, but, people are all of a sudden, shocked with, amazement that there were like Chinese populations in Mississippi, fourth generation, right? As if that's not possible, but so I think that's really important to mention the differences between the 70s and the 60s and the early 70s and then the late 70s, what it just in one decade, how far, it almost looks like and feels like 20-year difference. So then once we get into the 80s, we begin to see some beginnings of what will become the DEI industry, because you start having, academics who are producing sort of body of knowledge. And then you have the 1990s, where you then began having people who are taking that literature and, creating sort of trainings. And this is where then we go through the litany of the evolution of the the diversity, the inclusion, the equity, the DI, the IE, and all those particular sort of things. Those are literal time frames. They're not just sort of random, we weren't trying to be, joking. Like, these are literal time frames that this thing that we call DEI was once just this. And in other countries, it has become something else. Like, what we had a conversation when we were up in Canada with colleagues up there is EDI, right? And so the order of the words all of a sudden becomes something. But again, I know we were stopping you, Jared, from
sorry. Yeah.
No, it's good. We've covered a lot of ground. I appreciate it. I have there's random comments, like when y'all brought up McDonald's, I started laughing in my head about the fact that the local McDonald's here has a sign that says, "Thanks for supporting local small businesses," which, but yeah, I mean, I think, I did have the comment in the notes, which you all have kind of addressed in terms of the counterinsurgency doctrines. And just for the audience's sake, part of the reason that I'm always interested in that stuff is because there you have like military minds basically saying the same things, like saying, if we want to be able to stop this insurgency from becoming a full-blown successful revolution, what we have to do is, create these other oppositions, get these people on board with us, maybe help them with a little development and business, and get them voting and into these other structures, right? And it's just I think Dylan Rodriguez is the person that probably first, for me, kind of like made that connection really clear between what was being laid out in the counterinsurgency field manual and a diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives and how they kind of function. But I did really appreciate in the piece, actually, because I think there's been a good bit of work kind of making those connections now, of kind of looking at, okay, this, understanding it as counterinsurgency, but you all are really looking a lot too about kind of, the corporate sector, as you said, kind of soft power elements, and I think, political economy, which I think also gives you a way, which is probably the place I'd like to go next, which is to talk about kind of how DEI sort of functions, in terms of something we've talked about earlier, but in terms of labor, right? There's kind of a division of labor here that we could say in terms of like who actually benefits from these positions. So there's individuals, obviously, who might get that DEI officer job that might pay decently well, but then there's, the masses of poor working class Black folks, right, who don't necessarily benefit. And then there's obviously the sort of capitalist structures also that may benefit from it as a branding exercise. However, maybe that goes horribly wrong for them too, which is also why there's like the anti-DEI, stuff as well. So yeah, anyways, that was just kind of the next question I kind of wanted to bring in.
Well, I think one thing, again, there's a lot of embedded stuff in the piece, so we just might make a line or two about it. But I think one thing we said, let me see if I can actually pull the quote up. I'm always bad at finding my own quotes. I don't want to drag this out, but all right, I'm not going to keep doing it because I don't want to waste everybody's time. But effectively, I'm going to just do a word search here. That might save us time.
One thing while you're looking for that, another comment that came into my head when you were talking about leavening earlier. Also, I will say I've also heard board members of schools use that framing still in the 2010s, 2000. So that is still an ideology that exists among certain kind of liberal to conservative folks of, like, it would be good if we had some, diversity here to, my white 7-year-old will learn some things from this, like it, kind of a weird, So anyways,
it's an acknowledgement that the country, that we don't hear this as much anymore. I guess we hear it from the right, but used to hear it in the 2010s and even in the 2000s about, the country is browning. You don't hear it as much anymore, but country is browning by 2043, or I don't remember the year. The United States will no longer be a majority white country or something like that, which I always found that to be weird, and because it's like if 49% of the people are white and 30% are Latino and 15% are black, it's still technically majority white. So I always found that an interesting kind of explanation. But in saying that, it's like this. Well, we need to know about all these people that we don't talk to. We need to have some way so we don't get sued, so we can continue to make money. Like it's kind of implicitly saying like we need to know who are these people. We need to understand their culture, and so it's a very like it's kind of thing in sociology, very functionalist perspective, right? Like it's in that sense.
If it's not outright like a kind of white genocide, like fear thing that's behind people saying that too.
And that's what I'm saying. You hear that more on the right now, but in the liberal sense, it was more, we need to understand them. And on the right, it's like, we're about to be eliminated, right? It's the sphere of a black planet kind of energy, right? So it's like that, there's that kind of that back and forth in terms of what do we do with the browning, the darkening of America? Like there's a kind of, I think, a legitimate dispute amongst the ruling class in terms of that question. And that's why we see the seesaw action and DEI as a good front to see it, expressed. But again, there was a part in here. I'm gonna just read this whole paragraph. So Rasul, we both wrote this section, but dancing we did. It says, diversity was about who was invited and inclusion was about who was being asked to dance, which is actually a real workshop. That wasn't just us taking, silly jabs. It was a real workshop and that's literally how they describe it, as inclusion is being about being asked to dance, not just being invited to the dance. So dance we did, people needed to learn how to dance through employee resource groups, DEI trainings, and multicultural teams. But this thrust, once again, was not ably righting wrongs, as the quote-unquote right people were selectively snatched from hoods for degrees at universities and colleges. A select few of those graduates were plucked from their ranks and were inserted into key industries looking for global market expansion. Looking and sounding different would make millions for a firm. Chief diversity officers sat at the same tables as CEOs and CFOs. Vice presidents of diversity were on the same picture frame walls as presidents. The diversification of the increasing prison population was the price for the diversification in the middle class professions. So that's an important point. Like at the cost of primarily working class black people, it was us going to prison and just, the jobs being offshored. And at the cost of that were these promotions for a few people. The diversification of the increasing prison population was the price. Reagan and Thatcher were kissing cousins and closing of factories and deindustrialization of cities, destroying the black working class that had long since diversified the factory floor and assembly line in order to thrust the United States, the United Kingdom as early adopters of new governance. The low-wage service jobs that replace the factory floor remain diverse in color, religion, ability, and gender, but the diversity of poor people's jobs needed no DEI initiative capitalism would do. And I think this part is important. All of this is important, but if anyone has ever worked at like a shitty job, diversity is really not an issue. Like if the city has a diverse group of people, you will meet them at that shitty job because diversity has never been an issue at McDonald's. You know, they have a disproportionate amount of Black folks and other people, right? Like diversity has never been an issue at Amazon. I worked at Amazon before. It was the most diverse place I've ever worked. Like, I mean, literally people from everywhere, from religion. There was transgender people that worked there. There was folks from every country, damn near I could think of, people that didn't speak English, you know, Black folks from both the United States and, you know, Black folks, you know, or Africans from elsewhere. Like it was, everybody worked there. No one ever talks about it being like a DEI thing because you don't need it, because the people that are most marginalized, quote unquote, will end up working at these places anyway. So DEI starts on the premise of trying to get people into management positions, which is not pro-labor anyway. so it was never going to work because the entire premise is like, how do we get more Black CEOs? How do we get more Black people in executive positions? How do we get more, you know, Latin people in these positions? It starts from the premise of we understand the bottom is already diverse. We've done that just through the natural way that we do business, right? Like no one ever goes around and says we need more Black people working at Walmart. If you're in a city that has Black people, they probably work at Walmart. No one needs to do this. If I go to Walmart right now in Indianapolis, that's all really who works at Walmart is Black people, and no matter what side of town, you know. so it's not really an issue. So from that premise, you're already dealing with the situation where, you know, we're trying to get them into management, and management has no interest in organized labor. That's so it, obviously the people who get chosen for those positions are usually not going to be the most pro-labor people. You know, that's just a kind of logical critique of it, because they're not, you know, and it's an HR thing, which HR, a lot of these diversity departments are under HR, and HR, you know, comes out of a history of, again, trying to crush labor. It's like, what do they always say to you? They'll say, if you want to start a union, they're like, that's getting in between you and your employer. You know, we can work these things out. We don't need, you know, any kind of outside group or anything like that. You know, so it's about a management structure and getting them into more of those places. And that's usually what we celebrate is Black people, or we're using Blacks, but, you know, you can use different groups being in a position of quote unquote power, being at the table, being able to make decisions, and somehow them being representative of the group. So if we put, you know, so-and-so that's Black in the room, they're supposed to make decisions about everyone else because somehow they just carry this knowledge innately. They're not in any organization. They don't show up in the room with any kind of demands, any kind of objectives. It's just because they look like a said group, they're supposed to be sitting in this chair that represents that group. And as we pointed out earlier, that doesn't even work. Like they don't even get a lot of these diverse, like they don't even achieve these goals in most of these higher level management positions anyway. But even if you were to, like, you're never going to get to the labor part because it was never about that. That's not what they talk about. They went from even the best version of DEI in terms of maybe getting students into colleges, and that wouldn't get there or anything of that nature. That's at best just giving people opportunities, you know, in certain spaces. It's not about, you know, how people are paid necessarily or the rights and the collective bargaining. You don't hear that. Very similar when you listen to like Black capitalists talk and they talk about Black business. They never talk about their actual labor efforts. They don't talk about the standards for their workers. They don't talk about how much they're going to pay them.
They don't talk about capitalism.
No. So there's just they don't have any standards of these things because, and I think some of it is because, you know, a lot of this is also just infantilizing, right? Like you're kind of meant to sit at the kids' table, and a lot of what DEI does is put us at the kids' table, like because the corporations, you know, whether that's from the weapons manufacturing corporation down to Walmart, they don't take these people seriously. Like they're a nuisance. Nobody likes HR anyway. Like any job you work at, HR is never anybody's fans. Like I don't, you know, so I'm just saying it's inherent in the kind of construct of it where it would never become something that is interested in labor. Like it's just not a thing. The people who are going to be picked for those jobs are not going to be caught up in a labor question. And when you bring it up to them, they either have a blank face about it, or, you know, they're like, that's not necessary. They'll say that, they'll say you're being a class reductionist or something like that. Like, I mean, I've had these experiences. So I'm just saying, like, because they think that race somehow exists outside of political economy. So it doesn't really have anything to do with the actual job. We just need to make sure that we have breathing exercises, you know, before we do the backbreaking labor, you know.
This is my favorite add-on to DEI actually is the B, is the belong, like this idea that we should be like, wait, I belong to you?
Yeah.
Like, or I'm supposed to feel a sense. I know you want to feel a sense
Like
of
your family.
belonging
Yeah.
at your corporation, but that one is always, I mean, you know, it's right up there with human capital, right? In terms of terms that you're like, I don't want to belong to this place. I actually want to be, I want to get my check and I want to go home.
But this goes back to, I guess, the point that I also made, you know, earlier about reduction and flattening, you know, reductionism and the flattening of certain sort of ideas and concepts, because exactly, since none of this was ever dealing with anything material, it was just it just was allowed to sort of grow and evolve in further vague concepts. And so even when they add justice, you know, once they add justice, you know, justice becomes just what you would like to, you know, put somewhere, something, some notable thing. But justice is supposed to be in response to an injustice, but rarely is justice literature, justice trainings ever identifying the actual injustice that the justice is supposed to be responding to. So if you never bring up the actual injustice that you're supposed to be responding to, then the justice that you're coming up with is really almost meaningless. And it's definitely not going to be any sort of action and material.
And the injustice is abstracted. So if they bring it up at all, they'll say, historically, people of color haven't had some kind of opportunity, but it's not a specific injustice. And I don't even think that's injustice. But I'm saying that's how they're thinking about it, is this kind of just this amorphous history that's, we haven't had chances, so you need to understand the group or something like that. Like, but you can't point to anything, to your point.
Well, I think you may be giving them too much of a benefit of the doubt, because, you know, in terms of, you know, I've been on the side of contracting these people, you know, and looking at the literature and so forth. And so, no, injustice is never sort of articulated. So when they talk about, that history of those things, they're never actually connecting it to.
No, I think there's virtue signaling that it, in some cases, that it might be that, but no, it's not a literal one-to-one. Yeah, no.
Yeah. And but I mean, I think this is important enough to sort of, you know, just bring up real quickly, you know, and just to acknowledge to listeners here, you know, the you know, very recent death of Joshua Clover. Phenomenal writer of Riot, Strike, Riot, and, you know, a lot of sort of good talks that you can still find in the relationship to really giving us a material understanding of strikes and riots and when they occur. You know, last year we lost Jane McAlevey, you know, again, another phenomenal person who really gave us a sense of how to actually organize. Especially organized in labor sort of situations. And then, you know, in the midst of COVID, you know, we end up losing David Graeber, who, you know, was one of the more modern day brilliant sort of breakdown, you know, people who broke down capitalism. And the only reason why I'm bringing those three individuals up is that actual literature that deals with capitalism, you know, actually studies it and articulates it, much less what labor really is few and far in between. And at least for Two Black and I, when we think about even Black literature, you know, it's non-existent. You know, you still are pulling from, you know, people in the 50s, people in the 1890s, you know, it just doesn't exist as an area of study. So the reductionism and the flattening isn't even from a sort of sophistication of intent. It's just from a lack of never really pursuing a body of knowledge. So even when you're invoking diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice, and all these things, you're not ever really studying, ever. These are not about actual study. You're not doing actual prep understanding or connecting. You're hired by an entity to train them. You're never studying the actual institution that you're coming to train. You're coming in with your ready, set presentations where you end up talking about the history of slavery, the history of Japanese.
That's the injustice, right?
And you're talking to a group of people who, are just, the CEOs of Wendy's, and and they're just talking about whether or not they need to, open up a new branch, in Puerto Rico, right? And so instead of like walking people through what they need to do in Puerto Rico, they're just, giving their sort of standard speeches on these sort of key historical moments that people need to somehow have in their back of their mind, because having that in the back of their mind will influence how they may make decisions, which we know is not the case, especially because, capitalism makes any of us do things that we typically would articulate never wanting to do, because of just the need to survive in it, So again, I just want to kind of bring up or invoke that sort of reductionist and flattening sort of air that's been sort of growing each year for the past probably 7 years.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, for sure. That was great. I want to talk a little bit about the aspects of the piece where you delve into representation, and you delve into right after that section you actually just read, Too Black, is where you start to get into globalization and these as a process of kind of moving neocolonialism, bringing neoliberalism into kind of neocolonial, already developing neocolonialism. So can you talk a little bit, just walk us through what you're kind of looking at in that part of the essay in terms of, and I think just for clarity's sake for people, like just take a moment to kind of say what you mean when you're talking about representation, neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and globalization, like these processes.
Yeah, representation, I don't really know what that means anymore, to be honest with you. I think that's a whole other conversation, but I think like in theory, representation, like I was saying earlier, was the again, this is from the perspective of people who do these kind of things. Like, okay, we send Rasul to the room and he's supposed to represent us, even though Rasul's never met any of us or whatever, but he's supposed to represent our interests in a kind of abstract sense, and they represent a said group. Now, I think representation has evolved. I think we're in a kind of post-representation world where it's not really about people representing the interests of a group. It's about reflecting some kind of role models, kind of self-motivating thing. And it's like, well, like Jay-Z once said, my presence is a charity. So just being in the room becomes the work, right? Like that kind of like to Russell's point about how things are getting watered down over time. Just being in the room is the representation. It doesn't really matter if I do anything for you. I got elected president and that's really the end of it. I made it. I graduated from this school, whatever, and therefore I'm representing you. Like, and people can think about how well that represents them or not. So that's kind of how we see representation. I
think about that as you just made me think about the how much money would you take versus a dinner with Jay-Z thing that went around for a while.
Yeah, that was bad. And people really argued about, not taking, what was it, $500,000, but it was like, you should have a meeting because he might tell you something. But that's actually a good example, even though we're laughing, because that shows you just how far people have been removed away from the material. So you think you're going to get some advice that you can make more money than just taking $500,000 right in front of you. That's just how deeply we've been removed away from the material. Neoliberalism, I just wrote out definitions for these. This one was from our book. This was simplified on purpose. The absolute fealty to the free market to resolve all human activity. So simply just, that whether that's in economics, whether that's in psychology, whether it doesn't really matter. The free market should be the thing to resolve your problems, and you should rely on a market driven. You should so instead of saying we're going to have healthcare that's maybe subsidized through government or something, the free market will provide that. If schools, we know they don't need to be public schools. The free market will provide that. Libraries, anything and everything will be provided by the free market, and that turns us into a certain kind of there's a certain kind of subjectivity with that. So people's solutions to problems, come out of will be produced out of that kind of logic, not more so collective actions, but things that can be resolved in some kind of exchange or barter or something like that. Neocolonialism, I'm just going to use Nkrumah's definition. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state, which is subject to it in theory, independent, and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty, in reality, its economic system and thus its political policy is directed from the outside. That's Kwame Nkrumah in his book, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. And then who was a former head of state of Ghana, first head of state, actually, and was, couped with the backing of the United States. And then globalization, I thought about, like, the globalization really starts to take place into like post the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, it took place before that, but I think the way we think about it, because there was no longer a kind of competition against capitalism in the same way that it was prior. So once the Soviet Union falls, we did an episode on this on Black Myths that they called it the end of history. Was a Japanese writer. I can't remember the name of the brother at the time, but he wrote a book called The End of History. And he was saying, I don't want to mess the name up, so I won't say it.
Fujiyama, right?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. And it's so that the world should be interconnected globally, and the economy should all be integrated with each other, that there aren't like competing economies anymore, and they all should be, brought together. I think that this is just an extension of imperialism. I did write out I have like Lenin's 5 points, but I won't read all of that just for the sake of time, in terms of what kind of represents imperialism. But in terms of just globalization was a necessity because capital needed to open up those markets because it couldn't make profits in the same way. So the rate of profit was falling. And the fact that the Soviet Union fell was beneficial to capital because they could go and carve up all those Eastern European countries and also the countries that maybe the Soviet Union had influence over once it fell. I think more broadly in terms of in our book, we make the case. I think it's important, and this doesn't go with a lot of traditional, I guess, left history, but we make the case that neocolonialism has to precede neoliberalism, primarily because to even implement those kinds of policies where you privatize everything in a country, you need a head of state that is basically some kind of puppet for capital. You can't go in, or you have to either remove them, like Nkrumah was, like they did with Nkrumah. Nkrumah was, if you actually go read the history, United States, when he put this book out specifically, like they were like, that's the end, right? Like that was like their kind of last straw. They were already tired of him up to that point. So neocolonialism and having leaders in place who are willing to do the austerity is an important component. And we think sometimes the history of how we think of neoliberalism, where people started with Pinochet and Chile and things of that nature, isn't really consistent, because that's part of the problem of having kind of stages understanding of history anyway. Because if you go back to the Congo, I don't know how that's any different. So how getting rid of Lumumba specifically to get access to uranium and other resources in the Congo. You can do this with Iran in the 1950s. We can do this even with Nkrumah in 1965. Like these people aren't being ousted just because the United States hates them or they just don't like them. There's a very economic motivation, and there's a certain nature that they want that country to take on. And when these leaders don't want to do that, they get ousted. Either they're literally killed off or they're kicked out, or there's some color revolution or something is done to bend them to the kind of nature of capital. So neocolonialism even in the United States, is a necessity because, you know, we talk about in our book with all the Black mayors that come into power around the same period that we've been talking about in the late 60s and the 70s, and then continue to crescendo from there. Having those mayors in office allows for austerity politics to go further. And the austerity is a major part of neoliberalism because you have to cut social services and then privatize those things. And you need the leaders in place to do that. You need a government in place that is going to capitulate the capital to do that. So we think that that often gets left out of history within these kind of left frameworks, that people jump straight to neoliberalism. And I don't think that really holds up when you look at it historically. And I think that the history of, even when people say neoliberalism, they're talking about what really happens in like the kind of first world, because I don't know, you can't say that Africa under colonialism ever experienced liberalism, let alone, you know what I mean? So what are we really talking about? So the moment that a country gets a certain kind of independence and then they want to actually do things, even if it's just under kind of a nationalist policy for their country, then all of these IMFs and the World Banks come in and like try to subvert that. And then they have to sell off all their public goods. And they only had a shot to do this for a few years. So liberalism and then neoliberalism under the kind of like economic sense was something that I think there's a certain racial component here, because it's white folks in the United States looking at the welfare state shrinking and applying that to the rest of the world like they had a welfare state in the first place. So that's that. In terms of DEI, to answer that quickly, because I know I rambled there a lot, DEI is important for that neocolonial function because you need both. You don't just need heads of state. You also need a management kind of class of people, and you have to, and you need that management class to be diverse in some sense, so you can pillage a certain industry. So that's why you have a foreign diplomat, or that's why you have someone that works at your corporation that you can send over here to extract the resources from the ground because they look like the people they're about to go rob. Right, so DEI becomes important, not just in a kind of sense of just integration or whatever, and not even just in national security, like we talked about, even though that's a part of it, but also as a means of imperial expansion. Like DEI helps support those kind of efforts because you need to know the culture of the people that you're going to take from. You need to understand them to some extent. It's easier, it goes down better when you have those kinds of trainings, right? So it serves the kind of
soft power, right?
Right, soft power, yeah. Like you need that. So that's that. So globalization in the 90s, that's where we see the real rise of, we talk about more of the official rise of DEI coincides with, okay, now you've put in some of these neoliberal policies in place, you have the kind of neocolonial framework, and now you can just go out and expand the frontier even further, right? So then we say, just to speak to the kind of anti-DEI, I think really quickly, that, it's kind of you see now there's this portions of capital that are angry at globalization because we see this with these silly tariffs. They do not have the ability to actually they're losing money, one, and then they feel like it's a bad deal. They're sort of like, we gave away all these DEI stuff, we were nice to all these people. This is how the right is thinking, and now they got all of our shit. Now we can't build anything here, bring back jobs and all of this. So some of this, I don't think it gets talked about in the main discourse of DEI, really even on the left, is like there's because DEI is so weak, it leaves a vacuum for the right to fill, and then they can place some of their anxieties about being replaced or anxieties about, America not being at the top anymore. DEI becomes a way to do that because you've given away all these jobs. The liberal kind of component of the ruling class gave away all these jobs, really not that many jobs, but they gave away what appeared to be all these things. And now there's a certain angst aimed at folks. So like we say in the piece, the DEI allows liberals to kind of herd vulnerable populations into safe spaces, only to pass the ammunition to right-wing firing squads, and then feign horror at the shot, or feign horror and be shocked at feign shock at the horror that they enable, right? Like that's that kind of sensibility. So I'm trying to answer, because I know we're running long, so I'm trying to just answer several questions at once. But yeah, that's kind of how we are seeing it. I know Rasul could probably say more, but I hope that gives some kind of sense of like the global aspect of it, not just the kind of domestic policies that people get caught up in.
Yeah, thank you. Rasul, you want to add on?
No, yeah, I think that really covers, it pretty well. And yeah, no, yeah, I was about to say no and then start explaining something, but no, I think that covers it pretty well. But I think
Right on.
another key part within the essay is we're trying to link these as eras or periods, and so that's an important also thing for people to sort of think about is if the 60s are is the foundation of DEI, what then is the 70s, what then is the 80s, what then is the 90s, what then is the 2000s. These things are sort of growing and building, and so when we are talking about globalization, this is in the 90s, and so once we start entering the 2000s and 2010s, things are moving much farther along, which is then how we get to this particular point now. But yeah, I just wanted to sort of make sure people have an understanding of the context of us even going into these discussions.
No, right on. Thank you so much. And I really encourage folks to check out the piece. I also did add the first conversation we had on the book to the show description. If you didn't catch that, check that out as well. A couple other things, just quickly, and I have one more question for you both. But,
Go ahead.
Just quickly.
I'm just trying to respect your time.
No, I'm fine.
Yeah.
The first NBA game tonight is not good to Black, so I'm all right. So Francis Fukuyama, who was the guy who said the end of history, I just think I don't encourage anybody to read him because I'm not necessarily a fan of his work, but I just always think it's interesting to point out that he recanted. He basically was like,
I didn't know that.
Actually, things were better when we had socialism. We need that back. And so this is the guy
I never knew that. That's actually that's funny. Yeah.
On what Karl Marx actually got right. So yeah. Wow. And another thing, this is just a shout out because I see Ricky in the chat and appreciate Erica Keynes, and just want to note to folks that Liberation Through Reading has a fundraiser right now to get 100 books for African youth, and you can donate to this. It's Liberation Through Reading on Instagram, and all the details of that are below, so support that. The last thing that I thought we could kind of close on, because I think we've covered a lot, but I'm interested. I don't think you really go into this in the piece, so this is kind of outside of the piece, but like you've kind of laid out the anti-DEI, as sort of a kind of blaming, which is not unusual with the right? They blame immigrants, they blame Black people, they blame welfare queens, they blame DEI, like this is a very common kind of like, look over there, those people are causing your actual problems. But it's also happening, in this time period where certainly we have a far right administration. Certainly you have this kind of weird stuff going on in terms of like this anti-globalization sort of push, right? The tariffs, the idea that they're going to bring back manufacturing jobs, which they don't actually seem to have any game plan at all on how to do that.
And actually, if you look it up, they're actually destroying the manufacturing sector. There's been factories that have been shutting down recently due to these tariffs. But yeah, go ahead.
No, absolutely. And the tariffs, I think, are causing all kinds of businesses to shut down because they just realize they won't be able to operate in that environment. So those things are going on. You also have like this kind of this assault on universities, this assault on a lot of the soft power elements, I think, of the state in certain ways. USAID, right, would be another example. And I guess where mind goes on a lot of this is like, do you have any thoughts on what you think the wager is? Like, what are they actually like? Is there a plan that's being activated that where this is going? Because I appreciate the way you kind of, again, Rasul, to the point you made about like kind of trying to periodize some of these shifts. So I think what's interesting and important for us to think about too is like, what should we be thinking about in terms of where this periodization is trying to head right now with this administration?
Yeah. That's a funny. I mean, because we've been talking about this. Because we've been talking about this, but I think sometimes we make a mistake in trying to give what's all happening full coherence. So I think that's one. So, and what I mean by that is it would be, there have been administrations in the past maybe who do have like a coherent plan, whether it works or not. I don't think in this case that there's a fully coherent plan. Even when you look at the kind of coalition of the far right, it's an odd lot of coalitions that interests don't technically really align in some cases. So I think some of why you're seeing these uneven implementations of things is because the interests of these groups don't all align. So even like you see with Elon is not really a fan of the tariffs because he's got business in China, and even though that business is currently plummeting, but then you have a Peter Thiel who's like, we don't even believe in competition and is very anti-globalization. Then you have the Andrew Alderson family who's, very like, pro-Israel to extents that we don't even understand. Like, I mean, just to the furthest extent of genocide. And then you have the kind of base of MAGA folks who are anti-globalist and actually don't even want to give money to Israel because they're isolationists. So when you have that kind of wacky coalition, you're not going to get a perfectly coherent plan. Like you got the Steve Bannons, like it's just not going to happen. So I think that's one thing is we have to understand that they're trying things and they're testing their boundaries and they're not necessarily clear. So I think, this is part of the failure of the Democrats is, they hyped up the Republicans. They have Project 2025 and they have this, and it's like Project 2025 is a lot of it's theoretical. They don't even know what they're doing, so there is some, sensibility to try to test certain borders or certain boundaries, that some folks may call fascism. But there's also like a lot of confusion. Like, I mean, the fact that like with the tariffs, for instance, Trump, this was reported in the Wall Street Journal, and they said that, I can't remember the names, but there was advisors, one of his advisors is really pushing the tariffs. So the other advisors that wanted to get him off the tariffs sent his advisor to a meeting across the street. And while he was over there for 90 minutes, they then went to Trump and advocated for him to bring the tariffs down. Right. And then you have like the leaders of Walmart and Target going to Trump and being like, hey, shelves are going to be empty if you continue doing this. So this is not a coherent coalition. So I think that's just just to kind of set that up. There's not a coherent coalition. So when it comes to DEI, I think on some level, if you're trying to find some level of, I guess, clarity or coherence, I think using DEI as a kind of broader sense is a way to, just cut and cut and cut, because if you can say that these people are all a bunch of DEI hires that didn't earn their jobs or something, you can just reduce and really kind of finish off the kind of neoliberal project of austerity. You can cut things by labeling it as such, but even then we see that it's clumsy where they're saying a plane crash is DEI. Even right-wing people with a little bit of sense don't even buy that one. So as I'm saying, it's not like there's a full coherence, but I think it's somewhere in there is a goal to say, hey, let's cut this off. I don't even know if the reindustrialization is really a plan. I think that's more of a front because there's been no efforts done to do that. But again, it appeals to the base. But I think like Kali Akuno, I think you had him on the show, and he has a theory that all of this is really just about lowering the quality of life for the United States people in general. So they can then sell the products that they sell to us. They as in capital, they can sell those cheaper around the world, but you can't do that here because the standard of living is too high or something of that nature, right? I think that there's different theories on it, but I guess I'm just saying I don't think we should try to pin them down on one thing. I think that's actually a mistake because I don't think there's enough coherence that's been expressed in any reporting that's come out. Now, you can say that reporting is not real or anything like that. And so there's definitely an agenda. It's definitely imperialism, definitely capitalism. I'm not saying it's not those things, but in terms of the execution of it, I think sometimes we give them too much credit. And part of the problem with the state is always this overreach. It's trying to handle so many things. It's trying to shut stuff down. So there's a lot of distractions that the Trump administration does. So even like them deporting all these students, but then you look at the actual deportation rates and they're just on par with Biden. They're not deporting anybody extra necessarily. It's just they're making more of a pageantry and a show out of their deportations than Biden did. They're not bringing back. Biden probably was more successful in bringing back quote unquote jobs to America, with his policies than Trump is going to be. So a lot of this is just capital trying to figure out its own crisis and its own contradictions, and it does not actually have a plan. so it's testing things, and I think if there is a broader long game, it's let the right kind of just burn out. You saw what's his name? The guy used to work with Clinton, the bald-headed cracker. What's the guy's name? He put in New York Times. He was basically like Democrats. Craver, I can't remember the man's name. Carville, yeah. And he was like, basically, we should just let them crash and burn. So that's one perspective, I think, is that let's just let the Republicans crash and burn so we can kind of come in and implement a softer version of what they're doing. Because if at the end of it all, if you let them mow it down, people's standard of living, to Kali's point, will go down. And then when you come back and say you're going to fix it, it can be like 30% of what it was, and people will see that as a victory, right? So if you mow down all the DEI jobs, mow down half of the government, even though they haven't really reached their goals, people just think it's so bad, they get so desperate. Then when someone else comes in, they can be like, oh, we're going to fix it. But you've actually reduced and contracted the economy, but folks aren't going to notice it because it might feel better, right, than it was under this current administration. I think that might be the best I can give you, but I don't think there's actually a clear plan. I think it's a lot of competing interests, which makes it more dangerous, right? Because they're just losing their footing in the world. So they're kind of acting out like a petulant child at times,
Yeah, I mean, I guess to also chime in and just, I guess, hopefully be patient with this sort of roundabout sort of response. What Two Black gave you is just partly, from a couple of conversations, but in particular, 2 90-minute conversations in traffic in another country.
Yeah.
Because so what we were sort of, getting to in those conversations that I'm trying to express here, and just for your listeners, my main work is violence, researching violence, white nationalism. And so I can't in my sort of honest way call these people far right in any respect, but I think what we're seeing is the equivalent of those mayors that take taxpayers' dollars and buys Target gift cards that are for the Christmas party for children, and then they end up getting busted with using the gift cards for themselves. They bought plasma TVs and stuff like that. We never thought about, the mayor or the governor who does that could also be a president. And that's literally what we're seeing. We're seeing the gift card, executive, the person who buys the gift cards, that are supposed to be for the people and ends up sort of taking them for personal use. And I know that sounds, wacky and hilarious, but all people have to do is just look at, real cases all across the United States that have occurred over the past 30, 40 years of, there was a mayor just, I think 2 months ago during Black History Month that went to a couple countries in the continent of Africa on the city's dime for no actual business, and had the nerve to sort of push back on his city council for raising the issue for spending that money. And it was a personal trip, and we see this consistently, the use of, tax dollars, by elected officials for luxury, yacht rides and, Lear jets and so forth. The reason why I'm bringing that up, in that particular way is that this particular, regime has sort of shaken our previous, I guess, bad interpretations of the presidency. I think many of us might have thought that every president really was okayed by, some major elites. And I think one, especially with this current Harvard pushback, we're seeing old money reawaken, and and they're pushing against the new money.
And we see that even with the tariffs,
Yeah, and old money is always going to win, because their money has been in natural resource, since colonialism, and they were part of slavery, right? But we don't see, they're not a part of the fanfare. They don't sort of make themselves known. But now they are through Harvard, because Harvard wouldn't be doing this if their board of trustees wasn't behind them and their donors, which is an interesting sort of take that other universities clearly chose not to probably even really meet with their sort of board of trustees to do something more. But anyway, what I'm trying to I guess get to is that this old money, new money rivalry, cuts at the fact that this has always been a cash grab by new money to become more secure, like old money. And so we're seeing then that emergency need to better secure their wealth, even though to us we're thinking like, what security does a person who has $20 billion need? Like, but in their mind, there's always the need. If you have $20 billion, you need $60 billion to secure the $20 billion that you want, right? And it just keeps sort of going up. And so I think that's partly what we're seeing, is that sort of emergency rush to secure themselves, because their wealth is built off of things that are very sort of come and go trends, and they can float away very easily. And so this is why there's a lot of the hookups in terms of appointments and so forth. I mean, all appointments are typically hookups, but this is even more apparent, where you really do just hire your boy.
They don't even try to hide it. Really.
It's not even like I'm hiring somebody who is going to agree with me, no, and who's been trained in some area. No, I'm just going to hire somebody that is from my neighborhood. And so but we really thought that somehow the presidency was this thing that every person who got in was okayed by some major power system. And no, like, elections are actually real. I did not realize that, like to some degrees, and electoral colleges, vote. And these things are real in the sense that, people can get into these positions that are not necessarily fully vetted by all sort of strands of the state. I mean, some of us, of course, when we look at the 60s, this is why we know that, Kennedy was assassinated and these types of things, but many of us aren't born from that era, and we don't have that sort of remembrance. So this is a complete shock, to some of us, because we thought that. And so then we also then think that because they've been okayed, that there is a logic to their administration running. Right, there's a logic to their foreign policies. There's a logic to their domestic management of domestic affairs, as if everything is going to work very smoothly. And what we then now also see in this regards is that while there's these sort of endless sort of orders that have been come about and so forth, there's no logic to them. There's no follow through. There's no sort of understanding of what can really be done. But we do have an understanding that, many of the people who've been in that seat clearly have been sort of vacationing, because they could have easily executed executive orders tied to hunger and public housing and so forth rapidly, right? So that's a huge window that has been sort of given us, that like, I didn't know that, an administration can issue that many, engage that many sort of actions. But again, I know you're asking just something just off the cuff, just, that's not tied to our essay. And so how does that connect to our essay is that I think the anti-DEI piece is just simply, we have to give our base something, because if we don't give our base something, the base is also going to turn on us. And but they don't also understand that this is not enough. You know, closing down the anti-DEI does not open up a factory job, which is really what they want. You know, their base wants better jobs, you know, that have these other populations removed from those jobs. They're not asking for anti-DEI, but instead but these people were never about serving that base. And so they just think giving them the anti-DEI is going to be enough.
Which is very similar to what they do on the other side, right? Like liberals give you the DEI, they give you the anti-DEI. Neither side's material conditions are resolved.
Right, and that's why you see then it's dying down. You know, so many companies are pushing back, but then with this Harvard piece, with the Harvard being a major academic institution, now that's creating even more of a pushback where some companies are going to probably reverse their previous decision. So for me, I don't see the anti-DEI stuff as a part of a plan that's about moving to another sort of stage or something. It's just something to give their base. It's a distraction, like, hey, look here while this is going on, or hey, look here because we ain't got nothing that's going on over here.
And it's also, I think, a kind of petty payback, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Another thing I don't think is discussed.
Great point.
Is like, and I'm sure some people may get mad for this, but a lot of that, when Trump wins in 2016, they kind of broke the liberals kind of broke the rules when they tried to pull this whole, like, he's a Russian agent thing, which again, there was just no evidence of this. So people can feel how they feel, but there was just no evidence of it. And if you want to bring the evidence, we'll look at it. The evidence wasn't. So that had never really been done to the, like, even being assassinated is like, yeah, that's been done. But if you look at like that kind of history, it's very rare to see a president be accused of being like a foreign agent. Like, I don't know if there's any precedent for that whatsoever. So people never look at that as just as like outlandish as some of the stuff they're doing. So this is somewhat of a payback. Like, okay, that's the game you want to play. We're going to totally gut your base of power within, like, which is within the bureaucracy, right? It's within the nonprofit structure. And those of us who, are may work in those areas get caught up. Like, our jobs can get cut too or whatever. So yeah, they're going to go for USAID and the universities and even just the federal kind of bureaucracy, because it's a payback for what they feel like was a kind of soft coup, or a kind of like they that's how they genuinely feel. And I always say, if they had just let it run its course in 2016, we probably would have never even have to deal with Trump again, for whatever that's worth. But by giving them that one where he's a Russian agent and you try to impeach him off of that, and like that gave them a real sense of like, oh, these folks are really after us. Again, I don't care about either one of these parties, but I'm just saying, when we look at it as objectively as we can, I don't think we can deny that gassed them up a lot. And so this is also a revenge tour.
Great point.
And they can hit different points by doing that. And that might be the most coherent part of it, is just the revenge part of it. Like, oh, that's the game you're playing. Because liberals do have the upside in bureaucracy and like training, and the right really doesn't. That's part of why they're so incompetent. They don't train their people in the same kind of way to like run, just to govern. They don't train their people in the same capacity. They don't run any of the major cities for the most part. Like, they run states, but they don't really run like the states within the country. I mean, they don't really run cities, so they don't do a lot of day-to-day governing anyway. So it's like, this is a bit of a payback. And since liberals are still caught up watching Rachel Maddow look for some tax documents about Putin or whatever, they don't even see it that, this is, so that's something else, I guess, in the piece that we're getting at, is the way that there's an enabling that happens here. So by getting so caught up in DEI and trying to defend these fronts, and then people trying to sell DEI is more than what it is. Like, it's this radical thing or whatever. Like, that's not just the right that does that. There's liberals that gas it up like that. So they make it a target, but then they demobilize their people. Like, none of these people in these places are trained on anything other than just to teach or do their little bureaucratic stuff. So they're not organized in a way to actually fight back against any of the targeting, because it has a way of demobilizing folks in a sense where they're not Like in a different era, this couldn't happen because, you know, the Democrats leaned on like organized labor and stuff like that, where if you try to come for all their kind of like power centers, like they would have went on a strike or something. But that now, since you put everyone in the bureaucracy and you put everybody in these kind of managerial, you know, professionalized jobs, these folks aren't organized to do anything like that, you know, so it's just easy to target them, right? So I think some of it is just that, like, it's like, okay, we're going to pick y'all off because y'all have, you know, and it's again, it's some of this is still a childish, you know, tantrum, like you canceled us and free speech and all of that, right? Like they're on a tantrum, but it's like there is some ways that liberals have enabled that that I don't think a lot of us are honest about. It's not the right just coming up with these ideas out of the blue, right? Like there is a way that that's been enabled.
And we started this piece about a reaction, right? So, you know, affirmative action was a reaction to rebellions and the rage that was occurring in the cities. But all of these periods are reactions. Globalization, even though that might have been a desire, it wasn't really made possible until a wall fell in Berlin, and but they didn't know that was going to happen. Like they people wanted it to happen, but that caught them by surprise, and they had to react. And in that case, they were able to react very well. And what we're seeing now is probably not being able to react very well to the current sort of circumstances where, you know, they forgot that they deindustrialized the cities back in the 70s. So there aren't any factories to reopen, you know, here, you know, and so this idea of a tariff, you know, to then, you know, destabilize a sort of foreign sort of production, you know, era, and you haven't built up, or you know, you haven't rebuilt your,
you have no real plans to do so.
Yeah, you know, and so again, all these periods are reactions, and the need to sort of figure out what to do in relationship to what's been given, you know, and again, it started with the reaction to the rebellions, and it moved towards, you know, a reaction to having, you know, a larger managerial class. How do you sort of, you know, manage this, especially now, you know, with the divisions of labor, you know, where do you put these people? Because you can't put all these people as custodians, you know, in a university. So some of these people got to be professors, you know, and if some of these people are professors, then that may help us, you know, in certain ways, you know, so let's try it out. Right. And that ended up working. Yeah. And then, you know, so again, I think that's another part is it's a reaction. So, you know, unlike some of our colleagues, Two Black and I are always, you know, fine with saying we don't know, or let's see, you know, as opposed to jump into a, you know, like this is definitively what's happening, you know. Yeah, you know, I think we'll have a better sense by December what the remaining parts of, you know, the years will look like, because we'll have some sense of, you know, are they going to sustain the executive orders all the way up to December? Well, I don't think the United States public is willing to go through that. You know, like you got to start building a bridge. You got to still, you know, you got to, you know, open up, you know, a breakfast program back in the schools or something. Yeah. But again, I just want to sort of bring that back up.
No, appreciated. Akuya had a question basically about what your writing brainstorming process is like, because watching and reading y'all work is so fun. Curious how you get so clear in your analysis and writing. So yeah, I mean, I'm very curious about that too, because I really enjoy the way you two write together.
Well, I mean, I know Two Black may have a partner, but I guess I'm unfortunately his other partner, you know, in many cases. So, you know, we've communicated, you know, off and on, you know, and when I say off and on, like, I mean, like, you know, a couple of days off, off and on, for a sense, at least, you know, what was the protest? 2015, Mike Brown protests.
2016, yeah, somewhere.
Yeah. And so basically that's how we met, was in criticism to, you know, those, you know, protests. And, you know, from there, just sort of engaging in some sporadic conversations from there. And then it turned into sort of more ongoing sort of thoughts and criticisms about, you know, the conditions that we sort of see, and that sort of took the shape of, conversations that potentially led to, considerations of what I would even probably research, creating a podcast, pursuing my own book, pursuing an essay, collaborating on a book, pursuing another sort of piece of writing. So it's really about just that ongoing sort of conversations. And from those ongoing conversations, thinking which one of those things merit more deeper conversation. And so I guess, again, just in response to that question is that, and of course, some of our conversation has to do with, what's bad in music, maybe what's good in music, what's bad in terms of particular sports teams and what's good in some particular sports teams is broken up with that, and what's bad about certain movies and what's good about certain movies. But the core of it is about the analysis of the conditions in which people are living, but people have always been living. And from there, we just sort of tease out how we can use it either in committee work for organizing and activism, for content, again, for podcasts, for books that I may pursue on behalf of us in some sort of roundabout way, essays on behalf of us, that Two Black may do that represents me as well in some roundabout way. So that's sort of in a nutshell, that ongoing sort of dialogue.
Yeah, that's a good question, I guess. And I think it was that Stuart Hall quote. He said, "If it doesn't," what was that quote? If it doesn't help me figure it out, then I don't care about it. What was the?
Oh, no, he said that I want to figure out how to do something about it, and then there's an emphatic. So it's a just for your listeners, it's Stuart Hall, cultural studies, scholar. This was him being invited to a Stuart Hall conference, so which he was asked to sort of spontaneously sort of speak to a conference that was about his own work, and he's reacting to just the surrealism of having people talk about him as if it's a third party person, and so he also has to chime in saying, well, I think Stuart Hall would also, so to speak, in this way. But in the course of that, he does this freestyle, lecture from this spontaneous request over a 90-minute period where he just, it's an excellent lecture. It's called Looking Through the Prisms of an Intellectual or something like that.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Yeah. And so
but he said he wants to know what to do.
Yeah. Because he's always pushed back against ideology because he thinks ideology makes people lazy. And so it becomes like a church religion belief system, right? And it doesn't move people to do anything. And so for him, all of his scholarship, all of his work was always about trying to understand what we're up against, to do something about what we're up against. And so he makes this particular emphatic statement saying, that's what I'm doing. And maybe it's a criticism that he was making to also the people at the conference, because maybe they were going so down these intellectual routes with sort of interrogating his, or praising his work, that he was, also saying no, I think you're getting one piece clearly wrong. I've been doing all this because I want to do something about this. That's what has driven me to pursue this and then pursue the next thing and pursue the next thing, not to publish another book, not to have a conference, and so forth. But it's a phenomenal lecture.
Yeah, and I think that's what that was it. And I think that informs kind of like the working relationship here in terms of we're trying to figure out what to do. So you can never really rest on, okay, we just wrote this book, so we're done. That's part of why we were able to track DEI before 2025, is it's because one thing Rasul said is we won't even see all the laundering. We'll start seeing it after the book was done because we wrote it so quickly after 2020, right? So you're always just trying to stay sharp on, what's the kind of trends that are happening versus just getting comfortable and, okay, it's this. So, you know, there were choices we made on things not to write. Like we decided not to write anything. I mean, I wrote something on Palestine, but I purposely did not use like the laundering framework, because something we didn't want to do was also like, here's why my book explains this. Like, I think that's a bad tendency. I'm not trying to call anybody out. I just think that it's best to not do that, right? Like, it's just like, my book is the book. And I mean, I feel that sometimes, like when I see stuff, I'm like, yeah, we literally said that, but it's really trying to figure out like, how do we come up with analysis to figure out what to do? So like with Palestine, it was like, I think laundering could be helpful, but it was like, I felt like that was more, we would have wrote that would have been more about how can we insert our book into the discourse? And I think that's damaging, right? So even if there's something to be said, then maybe we can write that once it's not this trendy thing, quote unquote, but you want to just work on like, okay, we're trying to end a genocide. Let's focus on that. Right, let's not use it as a means to promote a book or something like that. So versus this DEI topic falls within our kind of like lane of study. So it's not let's trying to insert ourselves. Like we should have something on this because it falls into our lane of study, right? So I think it's just always trying to figure out a way to where we're just talking about what to do, and it just kind of builds from there. Like Russell talked about that conversation we're in Canada, and I was literally asking him. I was like, yeah, I just don't see. I was reading different theories on the tariffs and stuff, and I was like, I just don't really see a coherent thing. And I was reading people who were trying to explain it that way. And I was like, I don't see it. Like, if it was there, I would say it, but I don't see it. So we just kind of talk through that. Or it's like, so just really just like taking things on and analyzing them, and it's because again, it's not like we built some process, like we have some kind of like, you know, mechanized way of doing it. So it's kind of hard to explain. It's just more so in conversation of trying to figure out what to do and analyzing things and thinking dialectically. In that sense, you kind of arrive at a way, and I've grown a lot in doing that, because I mean, you know, 2016 takes me back to my mid-20s, you know, so I was in a much different place at that time than I am today. So it's like just trying to figure out how to kind of, you know, how to name something, not just to name it, but so we can be like, okay, that's what that is. Now that informs the work that needs to be done. And then even if we're not going to work on that topic specifically ourselves, at least we can craft something that we can give to folks so they can then act. Like, so even when writing, we're trying to figure out how can we help other people act, not just help them name things. I think naming is overrated. Like, how do we actually help people name and then actually do something? You know, like that whole Marx quote of like, the point is not to interpret the world, the point is to transform it. Like, that sticks with me. Like, how do we help empower people to do that? So if it doesn't do that, then it's not a useful analysis, honestly. You know?
Yeah, and I think it comes through, and I think that's part of what I see right within the writing is I see scholarship, academic rigor, obviously, but I also see you know, the poetic components, the kind of you know, the, I guess, creative writing sort of components, you know, but I also see an organizer perspective as well, right? Of like, okay, I have to explain this to somebody who, you know, may not give two craps about what I'm talking about, especially if I use a vocabulary that is not going to really relate to their day to day. And so that's part of what I see too, is that there's, you know, there's a strong literary quality within your writing, but there's also the scholarship, and then there's also kind of the organizer. And so all of those things, you know, kind of blend together to make something that I think is a pretty special collaboration that you two have in your work.
No, I appreciate it.
Yeah.
I think some of it.
I was just going to say too, Black, that most people don't sometimes may not realize that the poetic parts, you know, and the academic parts may be actually sort of spearheaded by who you may not think between the two of them. You know,
that's very true. Like, I'm the one that asked for. I'm the one that was like, we needed more sources for this piece.
yeah. But I think it's one of those. But that's, you know, representative of, you know, always finding a way not to necessarily push one's idea over another person's idea, but like constantly sort of compliment the good idea. So if the good idea today was given by two Black, okay, I'm backing it up. If the good idea was sort of given, by me, then, then he's backing me up. And so, yeah, in terms of the writing, it's just a matter of, telling each other how many words we need, by whatever sort of,
and then going over the count.
right. Yeah. But in terms of the organizing, aspect, as well, these are spaces that we both, inhabit, and at least in my case, just I'm not young, and so there was, prior to academia, there's a lot that I could sort of pull from, mistakes that have been made, but also successes, and but both cases learning lessons. And so what you also saw in the essay was, actual experiences. I was there at the start of the diversity trainings, receiving them. I was there when the nonprofits were going through the "it takes a village" phase, and I was there, because the world that I was in was city government, national nonprofits, state level nonprofits, and local nonprofits, and besides other political entities. And so while Too Black sort of brings to me and tells me about what's happening currently, I'm able to also bring some of that history.
Yeah. And I ask, because I'd be like, well, did we always do this?
Right. And so it's a way of happening. Yeah. It's a fuller sort of discussion, so that, it's sort of like, as a sport analogy, this is like, people not being limited to only talking about the LeBron era, people also being able to talk about the Dr. J era. And so if you have people who can talk from Dr. J to LeBron, you have this rich sort of discussions. But in place of sport, no, we're talking about somebody who read, Wretched of the Earth back in, 1990, and somebody who read Wretched of the Earth in the early 2000s. And so now both of us can bring those sort of reads of Wretched of the Earth, to another body of people in, the 2020s.
Yeah, and I think lastly, I think that's really well said. I guess for my background, also, even in the arts, which I don't talk about a lot, but like performing, and Rasul can say this even as a DJ, like you're in front of a crowd. Like you said something, Jared, about like we have like there's a clarity like that where we know we're talking to somebody, because it's like coming out of arts. Like if I perform a poem, like I see the people's reactions right there. And that was my original form of writing, was for like writing more so in front of an audience. So it's hard to imagine working out something that doesn't apply to an audience, like it's just like, I may not know, it's writing, essays and books are different than writing a spoken word poem, obviously, but there's obviously some crossover there, but it's also just the understanding that there is an audience. There are people who are searching. There are people trying to work it out. And even when it's poetry, there's people trying to work it out. I never just approached it as entertainment or just inspiration. Like this is for people trying to work it out, right? So it's always like with that intent. And even I think Rasul could even say, even in DJing, it's not just about dancing or whatever. Obviously that is important. Obviously if it's not good, so that's why the writing isn't like bad. Because obviously if it's not, if it's not decent, then people aren't going to listen to you or dance or anything. So you understand you still need to have a certain, I guess, just level of creativity. But you also have to, in that creativity, there needs to be some kind of purpose to it beyond just being creative for the sake of being creative.
Yeah.
So we're not trying to vomit on people working out our childhood traumas, like a lot of writing or anything like that, and then calling it scholarship. So it's like really trying to work something out, and then hopefully if there's a criticism of it, hopefully that criticism helps us work it out even further.
Right on. Appreciate that. Appreciate you both. Appreciate the conversation and the piece, the book as well. Is there anything that either of you wanted to just say in closing or anything like that?
No, one, just, appreciate Millennials Killing Capitalism. I didn't say it last time, but, 2020 was hard. And so having sort of resources to, sort of get your mind elsewhere. And so millennials was something that Two Black passed on to me. I think it was the Joey James episode. I think the first time she was on, so millennials became one of the sort of rotation podcasts that I tuned into, and so I appreciate that particular work. And so I just want to acknowledge that. But the other part, in relation to what you just asked, in terms of just additional sort of new work, I want to acknowledge my other co-author for a more recent book, the sort of, well-known DJ Rob Swift, part of the Executioners. He and I collaborated on a more recent release, came out in December, called The City of Hip Hop. It's a very, very different take on discussing hip hop. We do not talk about top 5 of, anybody's list. We're talking about housing. We're talking about policing. We're talking about incarceration as the basis for hip hop. And so, that's just something that's out there, but it also continues these conversations in a whole totally new space.
Right on. Yeah. The Executioners, formerly known as the X-Men, before they got hit with the copyright issue.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, it's dope. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a worthy read. I would definitely suggest. It's one of the most materialist, and there's not a lot of materialist histories of hip hop. So if you want to think about it from a perspective of conditions shaping things and not just the kind of abstract reference to a highway or there being rubble in the Bronx, and then we just kind of move on. They stay in that part that's usually just kind of referenced as a passing. They stay in that history. For me, again, I always appreciate coming on here. Appreciate the open access. Always going to be a fan. I guess the only thing, I don't know, the community or the Black Radical National Black Radical Organizing Conference wanted to advertise that. I don't know if you can. I don't have access to the live stream or anything, but you can put that in the chat. I think Kamal said he might be coming on to talk to you about that, so I don't want to elaborate too long, but just want to push that as that we're going to have a conference, a gathering here in Indianapolis at Butler University. I'm one of the organizers for that conference, and we're going to be, it's only $25 to register. We still have more information coming out, but it's sponsored by 6 different organizations, 6 different Black organizations, and African and new African organizations. And we'll be working on training people on certain skills for organizing, and then you also learn about existing work that our organizations are already doing. So you can get tapped in on that level, because as we've been talking about this conversation, leaning on DEI or even anti-DEI, these are not entities that are organized very well, and they're definitely not organized in our interest. So we need to we need to organize ourselves differently, and coming up with a different way to move, because clearly leaning on just these old kind of nonprofit state-based models are not helping. So this is hopefully a model to this, hopefully in a conference that can encourage that. So that's going to be on May 30th through June 1st, and then we're also going to have a rally on the last day after the conference. We're going to have a rally for the Pendleton 2 as well in Anderson, Indiana, where their case is actually based. So there will be mobilizing and organizing going on that weekend as well. So please reach out, sign up. It's only $25 to register. I would say get in there as soon as you can, because our hotel block price is only locked in until May 2nd. So if you want to go, get it locked in soon. If there's any confusion, you can reach out to me, and I can help you get linked up.
Awesome. Good way for people to reach out to you?
If you know me on social media, do that. You can reach me through my website, or you can just reach me through my email. I can send the email over. There should be a contact on that website as well. There's any.
Okay, yeah, right through the website. All right,
yeah.
Cool. I am supposed to do that with Kamal. We just have to figure out a date that works for both of us. But hopefully, we can get him on here soon to talk about the conference. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm interested in checking out this book too, Rasul, with Rob Swift. So yeah, maybe we could figure out another conversation on that if you're interested for that.
No doubt.
But yeah, appreciate you both. This has been great. And yeah, thanks again for coming on and having this discussion with me and our audience.
No problem.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.